I had never imagined that something as ordinary and unremarkable as a lightweight foldable stool could become the center of a public confrontation, serious enough to involve uniformed police officers walking through the sliding glass doors of a neighborhood supermarket. Yet that was precisely what unfolded on an otherwise routine Wednesday evening when I stopped to buy groceries while carrying the small collapsible seat that I had recently begun bringing with me on longer outings because of persistent lower back pain that had worsened over the past year and made standing in slow-moving lines an exercise in endurance rather than patience. The stool itself was not unusual or theatrical in design, consisting of slim aluminum legs connected by reinforced joints and topped with a tightly stretched black fabric seat that folded flat with a simple inward push, making it compact enough to slide into a backpack or carry comfortably under one arm without intruding into anyone's personal space, which is why I had never previously considered that its presence might provoke suspicion or irritation from a stranger who interpreted its practicality as some kind of social transgression. That evening the store was busier than I had anticipated, with fluorescent lights reflecting off polished tile floors and the checkout lane snaking backward past displays of discounted snacks and seasonal decorations. And as I joined the line, I noticed immediately that only 2 registers were open despite the steady influx of customers, a familiar scenario that suggested I would be waiting at least 20 minutes before reaching the conveyor belt, because my back had already begun to ache from standing during my commute home. And walking the aisles, I quietly unfolded the stool behind my cart, positioning myself carefully so that the legs remained entirely within the space occupied by my shopping basket and my own body, leaving a clear walkway beside me for anyone who needed to pass. And I lowered myself onto the seat with deliberate attention to balance so that no sudden movement might jostle the line or draw unnecessary attention. For several minutes, nothing unusual occurred, and I even exchanged a brief nod with an elderly man ahead of me, who seemed to understand instinctively the relief that sitting for a moment can provide. Yet the atmosphere shifted abruptly when I sensed someone staring from behind and heard the unmistakable sound of an exaggerated sigh that carried with it the weight of disapproval. When I turned my head, I saw a middle-aged woman clutching her handbag tightly against her side as though bracing herself for confrontation. Her eyebrows arched in disbelief and her lips pressed into a thin line that suggested she had already judged both the stool and its owner before uttering a single word. And without any attempt at subtlety, she announced loudly that what I was doing was inappropriate and likely against store policy. I responded calmly, explaining that the stool was compact, that I was careful not to obstruct anyone, and that I would fold it immediately if space became tight. Yet she dismissed my explanation with a wave of her hand and declared that public spaces required uniform behavior, emphasizing the word uniform as though the mere act of sitting while others stood constituted a violation of communal order. Her voice rose in volume as she elaborated on hypothetical dangers, including the possibility of someone tripping over the legs, despite the fact that they remained fully within my footprint. And she insisted that what I perceived as accommodation for a physical limitation she perceived as entitlement, a characterization that stung more than I expected because it reframed a small act of self-care as a deliberate affront to social norms. The store manager, alerted by her increasingly animated gestures, approached with visible apprehension and asked what the issue might be. And before I could respond, she launched into a detailed complaint describing the stool as an obstruction and implying that I had refused reasonable requests to remove it, though in reality she had not previously spoken to me until moments earlier, which forced me to clarify gently that I was willing to comply with any official store guideline, but had simply sought temporary relief from discomfort. The manager examined the situation, noting the available walking space and the absence of complaints from other customers. Yet in an effort to diffuse tension, he suggested that I might consider folding the stool until the line moved closer to the register, a request I accepted immediately because I preferred cooperation over escalation, unaware that my compliance would be interpreted by the woman not as courtesy but as validation of her grievance. Instead of expressing satisfaction, she declared that the matter had already escalated beyond internal management and that individuals who bent the rules needed formal intervention, after which she withdrew her phone and began dialing with deliberate emphasis, speaking loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear her report of a man creating a hazardous obstruction in a crowded store and refusing to follow instructions, portrayal so detached from reality that I felt a mix of disbelief and reluctant anticipation. as I realized she was contacting law enforcement over a portable seat. While waiting for officers to arrive, I stood beside my cart with the folded stool tucked neatly under my arm, acutely aware of the curious glances from other customers who had been unwilling participants in the spectacle. And I found myself reflecting on how swiftly ordinary interactions can transform into public dramas when one person frames inconvenience as threat within a short span of time that felt longer than it likely was. The police officers entered the store with measured professionalism, their presence instantly altering the atmosphere from mild irritation to tense formality, and they approached first the woman who had called them, listening patiently as she recounted her version of events with expansive gestures that suggested barricades and defiance rather than a compact camping accessory and immediate cooperation. When one of the officers turned to me for clarification, I explained in steady detail the reason I carried the stool, the care I had taken to avoid blocking traffic, and my immediate willingness to fold it at the manager's suggestion, even demonstrating how small it became when collapsed and how securely it fit beneath my arm, emphasizing that my intention had never been to inconvenience anyone, but merely to alleviate discomfort during an extended wait. The officers examined the area, observed the unobstructed aisle, and consulted briefly with the manager, who confirmed that there had been no refusal or disturbance beyond the complaint itself. And after a short private exchange between them, they addressed us collectively, explaining that while stores may set their own policies regarding items inside, no law prohibited a customer from carrying or briefly using a foldable stool provided it did not create a tangible safety hazard, which in this case it clearly had not. The woman attempted to argue that potential risk justified her call, yet the officers reminded her politely that emergency services are intended for immediate and credible threats, not speculative discomfort, and their calm yet firm tone conveyed that the matter did not warrant further action, leaving her standing rigidly as the attention she had summoned dissipated around her. When the officers departed without issuing any citation or warning, the line resumed its slow progression toward the registers, and I sensed a subtle shift among the surrounding customers, from tension to quiet validation, though no one voiced it directly, perhaps out of reluctance to deepen the embarrassment that already lingered in the fluorescent-lit air. I completed my purchase with a renewed awareness of how small deviations from expectation can provoke outsized reactions in environments where routine governs behavior. And as I exited the store, carrying both groceries and stool, I reflected that the object itself had not been the true catalyst for conflict, but rather the perception that someone had stepped outside an unspoken script about how individuals should behave in shared spaces. Although the incident concluded without legal consequence, it left me contemplating the fragile boundary between personal accommodation and public perception, recognizing that what feels like reasonable adaptation to one person may appear disruptive to another who equates conformity with fairness. And while I continue to carry the foldable stool when necessary, I now do so with heightened mindfulness, not because I can see wrongdoing, but because I understand how quickly practicality can be mistaken for provocation in the eyes of someone determined to enforce unwritten rules.